So when men could see that and
Mm.
hear that, women could tell that their birth coach was helping them, and then they worked together more closely.
Mm.
Okay. Then this got into a bit of a more complex part, which I am going to sort of talk about a little bit. And that is, how did labors end up with long labors, first and second stages? What were we seeing? And what we were seeing was these 5 phases of contractions behaving differently. So women who have what are called progressive labors, their contractions get longer, stronger, and closer together within an hour or two.
Right.
And they do that throughout the active phase of labor.
Right.
Women who have long labors, they can have the same type of contractions, and women will say that. I feel like I'm doing this over and over again. I feel like I'm not progressing,
Yeah.
right? And they're not progressing because their contractions are not changing. They're not getting longer, stronger, and closer together within an hour or two. And this is something that men could see and hear.
Right.
Okay. Right. You can see a longer contraction, right? You know it's gotten longer. You can see a stronger one. She's having more difficulty coping, or her breathing is deeper, or it's more intense. The same thing. They can hear that. A woman's reactive to it, right? But you can see that progression. And women will tell you that. That was a good one. That was effective. I'm not wasting one contraction. That's what they'll tell you. So what men noticed was that women who had progressing labors or progressive contraction, the contraction started, began to get more intense, had a really defined peak, started to come down, and then it went away. Where, and if that was all the way through, the labor would move along and a woman would give birth within a reasonable amount of time. And a reasonable amount of time is somewhere between 4 hours, which would be considered a very fast labor, to somewhere between 12 and 15 hours.
Right.
Once it starts getting past that, you're starting to have a long labor, right? So what men realized was that if a contraction started to go up, and then had this plateau and then dribbled away, that actually was what a non-progressive contraction looked like. And this then had, you could hear that in the breathing. That breathing never really developed that peak, right? And you can see it and you can hear it. And that doesn't then have to do with breathing. That has to do with our container either not in the best position. The baby is telling us you're not in a good position, or it's the baby is telling us you have tension inside your body, which you may or may not know about, or you're compressing the space inside my body in a way that I don't particularly like.
Yeah.
So we often see that I mean, we see that quite a bit. Or you're bending, you're bending the upper part of your body relative to the lower part of your body that I don't like. So
Yeah.
you can have a woman who's sitting like you are and have a very progressive contraction, and then lean forward like that, and hold on, just put her arms in the back of a chair or something. And some babies that just, they don't like that position,
Right.
and then the contractions go off. We see that often with this concept that's been part of the birth conversation for years, which is women who are having intense labors, get onto your hands and knees and it will back the labor contractions off. And women will say, oh, that's so much better. They're not painful. They're spaced further apart. The difficulty is you're actually delaying the labor then.
Right.
And this is where people in the childbirth conversation really have never really gotten this. They do not get that we have, women don't get it, right? That we as women have this capacity to be highly skilled on a moment-to-moment basis, because they believe that women have always birthed, it's natural, we know how to birth, we know how to do it. So with the breathing in labor, we basically went through the 4 ways we breathe, We had each person go through each variation and vary it to how they would do it, so they could connect that to life, to their lives,
Yeah.
and then begin to choose which type of variations of which of the four ways we breathe would you use to work through pain. So if you imagine yourself right now feeling really intense pain, you might go, right? And then we know, well, that's reactive, right? So
Mm.
if we know to choose the breathing, then we would do the same thing by going,
We would respond rather than
we
react.
would respond rather than react.
Right. And can I ask you a question, Wintergreen?
Sure.
How important is the person giving birth or the partner's belief in those skills? How important is that? You were saying before that people didn't take that panting, the breathing too seriously. When the women that are going to give birth are learning these skills, how important is it that they actually believe that these things work?
Well, that was interesting, sort of how you interpreted what I said, and it's not you. I would say that this is where we sort of culturally, globally, have missed this gap in childbirth. So when Lamaze and Bradley and Grantley Dick Reed, they were obstetricians. They could see that modern medicine, that births were being pulled into the standards of care in modern medicine. And they were rightly questioning it, but they were saying, well, some women don't need that. I mean, birth is spontaneous, and spontaneous sort of became, implied that it was a good outcome and that there was no damage. And that's not accurate. I mean, and that's where the word natural and normal and physiological never got really defined. I mean, physiologically, you can have a medical problem, or your baby can have a medical problem, and it's normal and natural. A woman can tear through her rectum. I mean, you have all these things that come with normal and natural. But when these three men started, they really were trying to say, yeah, but there's a class of women, right? And that class of women are women who don't apparently have any risks. So you, for instance, might be a very healthy woman, but your you're having twins, or you're having a breech baby. So your baby then is at risk. You're not at risk, right? So that becomes then an added confusion. So they were trying to say something which was correct, and it had a political
Oh, of
intent.
course. Oh, of course, of course. What?
Huge.
Yeah, of course.
Right. And that led into over, your place with the National Childbirth Trust, and the development of more of midwifery, global midwifery, supporting women's choices. But when we get back there, that was what they were doing without intent. They weren't trying to do this, but in hindsight, which is always 2020, they made a classic mistake that got acerbated in the 80s. Classic mistake was not just saying 100% of pregnant women are going to give birth. 100% of pregnant women should have some level of breathing and relaxing skills merely to help reduce suffering.
Yeah.
Right? If suffering was a reaction to the pain in labor, it wasn't a risk or a problem or a tragedy. So if they had just said 100% of pregnant women are going to give birth one way or another, we just want all women to have some way to cope and manage better, everybody should use these skills, then that would have been heard as a collective to do, right?
Yeah.
In the US, where Lamaze was taught in every hospital in the United States, what labor and delivery nurses, because we didn't have midwives, and obstetricians saw from the 60s and mid 70s was multiple millions of women not suffering as much because they were using skills. But because the message was it was for low risk women to achieve natural birth, pain-free labor without medical care.
The expectation was too much.
Was different.
Different.
And so therefore, not all women, many women who thought that they fit into that group. I practiced, I was a low risk woman, right? So my husband and I practiced religiously a half an hour every night for 6 weeks. And how did the skills work? I ended up getting induced, and I called the teacher later, and she said, well, they don't work when you're induced. To which my thought, and did not lead me into any of this, was how can you have skills that do not work for everybody?
Right.
Right. So when I did get involved in it, which was the next year by accident, that was definitely on my mind. And it was on the mind of everybody who I was working with, because sometimes the skills worked, sometimes they didn't. But the Lamaze wasn't sustainable, and we couldn't adjust them. They weren't adaptable. And that's what the dads were saying. Right. So if we take those two paths, 100% of pregnant women will give birth. They should just learn skills not to suffer. That was not taken. The other was low risk women to achieve natural birth, pain-free labor with no medical care. So the next group of birth advocates said skills don't work. So what they did when they said skills don't work is to say, we want low risk women to opt out of medical care. So because the theory was women know what kind of birth they want. They should be able to tell their birth professional. The birth professional should give them the birth women want, and you should write that down in a birth plan, right? And choose what you want. Choose what type of medical care you want or don't want, and you should be informed. And the skills don't work thing then got interpreted as women have always given birth. We know how to do it instinctively, because there are many women who just birth quite easily. But you never know what your birth's going to be like. That's a global thing.
Of course. So I suppose the point I was trying to get at there was these skills, in terms of what effect do you think that having these skills gives women in terms of the confidence that they have going into a birth? Because even for me, the thought, I've never been pregnant, but the thought of me giving birth, even the idea is terrifying. And I know, especially from, of course, working in the well-being sector, from so many other things to do with breathing, even anxiety, mental health issues, if you have the confidence that you will get through a hardship, then, you know, there are so many studies on it now, of course, you're so much more likely to actually get through that in a much better coping way. I guess that's more the point I was getting at, is in terms of the confidence.
Right. I mean, I love talking to you because you get such a great mind and you ask so important questions. So with Lamaze, people felt, if I learn this, it will work, right? But they weren't adaptable, adjustable, and sustainable. So people got disparaged by them. But when the next group of famous birth advocates were saying women have always known how to birth, we don't need skills. Cows and cats aren't taught to birth. Women don't need to birth. All childbirth preparation classes shifted over to information gathering. Right. And skills were barely taught, which meant there was no evolution of skills. Birthing better be kept evolving.
That's what I'm talking about, your skills.
But this is important, because the collective in the United States, which I think was quite unique, was everybody should take Lamaze and Bradley. That was not going on in the UK. That was not going on in New Zealand, right? But when the childbirth conversation went global in the 80s, because the ability to have a conversation globally, then we were told, no, just leave women alone. They know how to birth. So skills became this huge gap from our viewpoint, because you need to prepare your container to let out a big object. You need to know how to cope. Whoever's going to be with you should know how to help you open up to let this big object out.
Yeah.
And you need to know that they work because you have this capacity to adjust and adapt and create sustainability in not just one skill, but in a number of skills. So when women are in labor, let's just talk about in labor, our minds are very acute. Okay, they're heightened. Okay,
Of course.
in some ways they're heightened in a similar manner as if when we're randy or horny, if we've learned to really be a good lover, learned the skills to be a good lover, we have a heightened awareness of what our touch is doing to another person's body.
Right.
And we are building on that awareness, right? That's that heightened awareness, right? Childbirth is unique like that. It drives us into that heightened awareness. Most of us are not aware in life like that, where it's coming in your work with women's menstrual cycles. We have that heightened awareness, but it comes cyclically. With women with menopause, it becomes a broader, just my life, I get this hot flush out of nowhere, right? And the other place is in COVID long haul recovery, because I'm doing a lot of work with long haul people now.
Right.
And they have an intense heightened awareness of their body with a lack of skills of how to cope with these far-ranging symptoms.
Right. So are they being hijacked by their own sensations of their own bodies?
Not a word I'd use. So
right. Or overwhelmed. Overwhelmed?
They're overwhelmed. Right. So earlier in the conversation, you talked about pain relief in labor, and that's what the medical profession can offer you, is to just numb the pain. They've done it differently over the years, but now it's epidural, so you numb the pain. With COVID, it's going to your doctor with hoping they can give you something to fix the problem. And the doctors don't know. They're not at fault. They're not to blame. We don't know, right? So I'm bringing breathing skills into the work I'm doing on the long haul Facebook groups, right? Because a lot of them, and this is where this becomes a bit more esoteric, when women are overwhelmed in labor, their sympathetic nervous system causes them to get tense, reactive, fright, flight, fight, and freeze.
Panic,
Right? If we are our breathing, our ability to focus and pay attention on multiple skills that we can use at the same time, staying open, softening inside the pelvic clock, that every contraction is a progressive contraction, then we are in our parasympathetic nervous system. Time slows down. We're aware of time. It stretches out. And we have this incredible experience of being in and participating, responding to experience that we're not able to control. And we do it on a moment-to-moment basis.
Right.
And the person helping us sees that and can participate in it in this very subtle manner, right? So have with breathing what you're doing with the menstrual cycle, what I did with breathing, it was interesting because when I talked with Patrick about it, he couldn't place the nose belly breathing into what I was saying, because birth is so infrequent. Right. It's just so infrequent, and it is so unique, and it's an activity. Right. And every human activity that any of us do, we feel more confident and more capable when we have a set of skills. So in the childbirth conversation now, there has been since 1980s zero interest in skills, because it is tied to the philosophy or ideology that women have always given birth and that we instinctively know how to do it. And that other mammals aren't taught, and we're a mammal and we don't need to be taught. But we are a very unique mammal, and we're very unique. So the work you're doing with breath during each phase of this menstrual cycle means that when we learn skills, we can choose to apply skills on a moment-to-moment basis as we experience things. And so, we want more people to want to become skilled, and we want more people who are pregnant to recognize that breathing isn't the only skill. That we discovered in the 80s as the cesarean rate went up, really the most important thing was to prepare your container, your body, to create space, to be mobile, to be flexible in the pelvis, inside the soft tissue of the pelvis, and inside all of the soft tissue of the vagina. And one thing before we wrap this up is your issue of terror, right? I'm terrified of birth. And this is what we learned. As humans, we are hardwired to be frightened and anxious about pregnancy, particularly birth, because if there is no medical care, we are on our own. We may be on our own within our village, within our community, within our family, but we have to rely on the health system that our society, our culture developed. And so, and we're hardwired to have that anxiety because it's a gift. And it's a gift because when we are anxious about something, and this is true about our menstrual cycles, menopause, COVID, is that we become more observant.
Right.
And when we become more observant, we begin then to ask ourselves this question: do I feel that I, say, or my baby, if you're pregnant in birth, or I am at risk of dying or being seriously injured within the next 5 minutes? And if the answer is yes, do something or get help. If the answer is no, then you say, am I, or my baby, if you're in birth, or it's I for yourself, you have COVID, if you're in an acute phase, am I at risk of dying or having a serious problem within the next 12 hours? And if the answer is yes, do something or get help. If the answer is no, I don't think so, then what you do is honor the observation and keep observing until that sense of anxiety either leads you to getting help, or you say, nope, it's okay.
It's dissipating.
Having skills at all of those phases helps.
Yeah.
The reason we have this anxiety is about pregnancy for sure, is about birth definitely, because women are at greatest risk after the baby is born and before the placenta delivers and for a period of time after. But where this gift evolves and blossoms is when we have a newborn child who cannot tell us what's the matter. So when we have been told since the 80s, don't be afraid of birth, it's instinctive, natural, women have always done it, women suppress this gift. They don't know how to develop it. And when their baby is a newborn, the baby's asleep, that's fine. But as soon as that baby moves, you hear women say, what's the matter? Because if you had developed the gift, you would have watched that baby and said, is something going to happen in 5 minutes? No, I don't think so. Something going to happen within the next 12 hours? Well, the baby looks like it's getting more restless, right? And it's doing,
right.
Oh, maybe it's hungry. Or it's squirming. Maybe it's wet, right? And so instead of being anxious, you grow this capacity to be observant.
And respond.
And this then leads into why you decided to do all this work around the menstrual period.
Yeah.
Because that's the gift you're giving women, is this huge ability to be okay about being observant and then having the skills to work through that cycle that we have.
Yeah.
And that's wonderful.
Yeah, thank you. Well, ultimately, you know, and something that I was going to mention in sort of tying up all of this was a huge reason, and something that continuously keeps coming up as I've been making this series of the breathing through your menstrual cycle, is having autonomy over your own health. And that the more awareness you have of your internal system, the more autonomy you have, the more you can listen and understand when something is either in balance or out of balance. The more skills you develop to learn to respond, then the more autonomy you have, the more confidence you have. And something interesting you said there, especially about having a newborn, is the question I had for you was, of course, do these skills of having autonomy almost of your own birth, of having the skills to cope, knowing it's not going to be easy, but at least being able to respond in some sort of coping way, actually translate to being able to cope as a mother going forward, because that's not easy, right?
Right. And this then brings us to a very much larger picture about this. We find, and for 50 years, this is why men were so very important. Okay. So they were really instrumental in developing the body skills from 24 weeks, the internal work from 32 weeks, learning the skills to cope. But what men were saying is that by 24 weeks, that's 6 months into pregnancy, I'm left behind. So then they developed 10 skills to develop through the 5 phases of pregnancy: conception to 12 weeks, 12 weeks to 24, 24 to 36, 36 to birth, and birth, because you're still pregnant till your baby's born.
Yeah.
And those skills are on the Udemy platform, as the Mother and Father's Pregnancy Academies. Because what happens is that we're skilled as adults before we get pregnant. And because there is no perception of skills in a menstrual period, for instance, women stop having their menstrual periods, they get pregnant, and they go into, I don't know what I'm doing. And men go into, I don't know what she wants. And so we suddenly become children again. We feel unskilled. Then we're being told, just make choices. Well, what kind of births do women choose? I want everything to be safe, and I want a good birth. Right?
Yeah.
And then they go into details, right? And those things don't unfold. And so they come into parenting, particularly with the first baby, often now traumatized.
Wow.
And they then are, the man's traumatized, the woman's traumatized. They don't adjust well to that early parenting phase because they lack skills, right? So what we tried to do in Birthing Better, and what you're doing in tying the menstrual period, just imagine this with me, because you and I have recently met, right? And you know, this is in some ways an incredibly profound talk. We hope that a lot of people will understand that. What you are doing with the series you're doing on the menstrual periods is you're basically saying to us as women, and to a degree, our partners, if we have them, during our menstrual period, we can have a consciousness of how we move through this.
Shift
right?
and change.
We don't have to feel this overwhelm, right? So it's not that it's an anxiety, but it's an anxiety because we don't know how to cope or manage or deal with or handle. So you're giving people a day-to-day experience of how to move through this cycle. Let's imagine that women and men appreciate that. And we can then at some point investigate what's happening to men. But let's just focus on the women. Imagine yourself, because you earlier, just a few minutes ago, said I'm terrified of birth. So I explained that gift of fear, which I know you're not as terrified now. Yeah. So if you're doing this menstrual cycle stuff, and you know that there are these 10 skills you can develop as soon as you get pregnant, things like patience, attention to detail, kindness, right? Humor. And you develop those skills, and you can develop them with your partner, to each other, to yourself, towards your baby. And then you begin to prepare your body to open up to let this baby out. And then you develop the skills with your other significant, whoever's going to be there with you. And then you use those skills through the activity of birthing your baby. And you have primed yourself to know that after the birth, you are going to use observation and some of these relaxation and breathing skills and moment-to-moment awareness to then work through this early phase of parenting. imagine our society, imagine how that impacts ourselves as women, our relationship that we have with our family and our significant other. Imagine that.
Huge.
And we can imagine that. And so I have spent 50 years saying to people in the birth field, we need to grow a skilled birthing population. It should be just normal and natural when you're pregnant that you seek out some skills based method, self learn them, use those skills the best you can as you do this activity of birthing your baby. Because even if you're imperfect, even if you don't feel this was just a highlight experience,
Yeah.
you use skills. Because when you go into parenting, not all of parenting is a highlight experience. However, if you feel I can work through developing skills, or I can just calm my breathing down, right? I know the difference between when my sympathetic gets into overdrive and I get titchy and active and hyper, and I know when I can be calmer and more settled. And so I can choose that at the moment when my kid's just been drawing on the wall of my house. And honestly,
Yeah.
so we see this as a massive, societal shift of a greater level of competency.
Yeah. 100%, being able to understand what you and your baby need, and you and having autonomy really over almost your own life as such, as in being in the driver's seat rather than just letting go of the steering wheel and spiraling out of control.
And we need somebody who has an interest to do this for menopause, right? That's never going to be where I do this, but we need somebody in the breathing field to really get focused on the other change of life, what happens as we move out of that reproductive cycle.
Yeah. I mean, hopefully, it is, of course, the breathwork world is growing, and just the world of awareness is growing. Maisie Hill, again, is another example. She's written a great book called Period Power, which sort of inspired my whole journey, really, with being fascinated by the menstrual cycle. And she's just released another book all about the menopause. And it's great. It's very conversational. It's very funny. It's just very real. And and she talks about the breath and different things in there, and many other things. But yeah, hopefully one day as well, that I'm sure there is out there somewhere,
somebody out there,
somebody out there listening, get in touch. But yeah, hopefully there is a breathing practitioner as well that will help women be skilled, through their menopause, because also, it brings people together, even just learning skills that are sort of cohesive to a community. That's very bonding, and it's to know you are supported just because you know the same skills as a large population of people. That's it. You almost feel included in a way, you're in the know, and again, confidence.
I mean, that's my generation of fathers and mothers who birthed in the United States in the 60s from the mid 60s to the 70s. My generation, multiple millions of us, multiple millions of us. What you're talking about is that we all felt we birthed better. Most of us felt we had a positive birth, and we had a positive birth with every type of medical assessment, monitoring procedure, because that was the standard of care at that time. So that collective that you're talking about, my generation of women in the United States and men in the United States experienced. Right. There's not that experience now. It's that division of birth. And so, you have this very profound, understanding of being able to say that we can achieve that again around childbirth, because we can grow a skilled birthing population. It's harder to achieve around menstrual cycles, but because how do we do it? Menstrual cycles go on for years.
Yeah, of course. So, but that's just increasing the awareness of anyone who identifies as female, which of course is great preparation for progressing to
right,
be.
It is. However, often when people would say to me, well, women aren't going to become skilled, right? But they do, because at 24 weeks in pregnancy, you're more than halfway through your pregnancy. Everybody knows that. So it's not a lifestyle change, right? It's not like changing your diet. It's not like thinking differently. It's not like getting exercise. It's not like anything like that. It's harder to have that collective ability to something that goes on over a longer period of time, that gets, changes for women. So when I go back and think about when I first got my menstrual period when I was 12, and how I felt in my 30s having my menstrual period, what I had known, what I had learned, how it changed month to month, what was going on. It's sort of, I'm in a particular field which captures people for a very, very short period of time.
Yeah.
And birth then becomes even a shorter period of time. So in some ways, it's easier for us to capture skilled birthing population.
Oh, yeah.
And than it is to capture a skilled menstrual population, right? But it's a good goal. And if we can find people, so we're more likely to be able to replicate what happened in the United States, where you have multiple millions of women feeling positive about their birth, right? Because it's just a very, very short time frame. But I appreciate that belief in youth, and I do believe that breathing is going to become more known. Certainly on the long haul Facebook groups, it is not known.
Right. Well, I truly believe as well will become more known. And as I said before, for me, there isn't, it's not even about, I suppose it is about skill in some way, but it's more for me, just being a tiny part of creating more awareness of the menstrual cycle. It's about women having autonomy over their own health and not rushing to not putting themselves on the contraceptive pill, which is something that happens a lot. I mean, that's a whole nother podcast episode, but not that there's so many people on a contraceptive pill that have been put on it simply because they had a skin problem, or because their periods had a heavy flow for a while, and things that can be controlled with knowledge and with awareness and with so many other things, without simply sort of putting plasters on things, with knowing that the power of your body and how communicative that menstrual cycle is in terms of how your body communicates to you. For me, it's about people having autonomy over their own health through awareness, and that it's purely that. And for me, that is why breathing had such profound effect on my life. And getting in touch with my menstrual cycle is just an extension of that.
Yeah, and that becomes, I mean, in childbirth, this is this intense debate between natural and medical.
Yeah,
and
I think both are valid. Both are valid in their own right.
Right, and better families developed it. I mean, I'm a director of a trust called Common Knowledge. Our mission statement as a trust is that you or I, as an individual, you within your family or society or whatever, should use any and all any healthcare, wellness, whatever you want to do. And so we avoided the conversation of medical and natural, right? So if women, women decide to use medical pain relief, they continue to use
as they should,
right? And so we dropped out of that conversation very, very early. But it's interesting that you bring up about, I mean, modern people just want things fixed.
They do. Quick fixes. Yes.
It. I mean, it's much harder. Yeah, it's much harder for people to want to sustain a conscious or skilled lifestyle. And for many women being on the pill, my generation, I mean, when I gave birth in 1970, there was almost no birth control. There were rubbers. Diaphragms were coming in. IUDs didn't exist. The pill didn't exist. Right. So when we had those things, we believe that's where we got our autonomy.
Right. Exactly. It's all about that belief and that mindset, 100%. But even that's, I think we're going even into part 3 now. We could talk for hours about it, of course. But honestly, it's been amazing talking to you, Wintergreen. And just to finish up, where can people find you, or if they want to find out more about your work and your trust, then where can they find you?
Well, our website is birthingbetter.org.
Right.
And we now have 12 courses. We have a COVID course because I sort of came out working behind the trust. I mean, I basically stopped in the 90s trying to be public about growing a skilled birthing population because the resistance through the childbirth conversation had been so intense from the 70s to the 90s, where
Wow.
this natural birth conversation was so exclusive of skills.
Yeah.
I was told over and over again, you're belittling women's ability if you say we need to be skilled. You know, you're dismissing our capability and our autonomy. I mean, these are complicated,
Wow.
right? So in the 90s, I decided that I would just work behind the scenes in the trust and develop the content, because content was permitting us to present multimedia in a better manner. So when COVID happened, I just said, no, I can't do that anymore. And I started come out and do a lot of YouTube videos. We have a YouTube, I think it's Birthing Better channel.
Cool.
And we've just finished the last of the 6 new courses. So we have a home birth course, a hospital course, for breech course for first-time mothers and fathers. We have the complete skills. We now develop birth coaching for VBACs, or birth coaching for all births. And they're on birthingbetter.org, and it's all online. It's all in learning management systems. And
Perfect.
And I, of course, work with people individually, and a lot of that's done online now. And it's been an absolute pleasure to have met you and to be doing this, because, as an unnerving period of time it is, it has created a huge amount of new and exciting things. And I am incredibly supportive of the work that you're doing, and
thank you.
been absolutely delighted to have participated in this.
Thank you. It's been such a joy to talk to you, Wintergreen. And I've learned so much just from this conversation, as I do every time I talk to you. So thank you. It has been a pleasure.